Hi guys, it's Miss Savanchi. I just wanted to go over the graphic organizer with you. So first thing I want you to do, if you have not already, is go ahead and write the essential question at the top. So how did the colonists debate, compromise, and negotiate among themselves and with Britain prior to the Revolutionary War? And so I'm just going to pause it right here, and then I'm going to come back when I am finished. All right, guys, so you will notice that I have written my essential question up here, and then I also have my graphic organizer. So remember, there was a picture of this graphic organizer in the assignment itself. Okay, so today we're going to answer the essential question: how did the colonists debate, compromise, and negotiate among themselves, but not only amongst themselves, but also with Britain prior to the Revolutionary War? Okay, so the first one that we're going to talk about is the Albany Plan. Now, the Albany Plan was in the escape room. So the Albany Plan was in the early 1750s, and it was created or tried to be created by Ben Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin. Okay. So Ben Franklin had seen how the five tribes had been working together. And so he also wanted to unite and band together like them. He believed that if the colonies united together, that they would be better off. Okay, so within this Albany Plan, he said he wanted to elect and send representatives to a Grand Council. And there again, those representatives are going to be elected by the people of the colony. Now, unfortunately, within this Albany Plan, even though it was a good idea, many of the colonies did not want to do that because they felt if the colonies did this, they were going to lose control. So they did not want to lose control. So this plan was actually a failure. Okay. So even though it was suggested, the Albany Plan actually never came into fruition, or it never actually was a group. There never was a grand council. No one ever elected representatives or sent representatives. But this was the beginning of the colonists trying to negotiate amongst themselves and compromise amongst themselves as to how are they going to come together to try to negotiate with the British. And so then in 1764, there was a committee of correspondence created. And so within that committee of correspondence, there again in 1764, it was specifically made to negotiate with the British. Now, the first committee that was formed was actually formed in Boston. And then after Boston, it was New York. And then from there, all the others followed. Now, there again, this committee of correspondence was there to negotiate with the British. It was also to keep the colonists informed. So they're going to keep each other informed of what each colony is doing. And aside from being informed, it's also going to notify them of protests, because remember, 1764 is right around the time of those taxes being imposed. And one of the ways that the colonists protested those taxes was by boycotting. So it is going to need to be somewhat organized. And in order to organize that, they're going to need to form this committee of correspondence. So it is going to be organized. So there's not going to be any disarray. There's not going to be chaos. They negotiated compromises. I'm going to put with Britain just in case y'all forget. And then those compromises are going to have to do with taxes and land. Eventually, this committee of correspondence led to the First Continental Congress. And there again, so this committee of correspondence was about 8 to 10 years after the Albany Plan. So our next one is the First Continental Congress. Now, there again, this was created to negotiate with the British. So there again, they're implementing taxes. So the Committee of Correspondence lasted about 10 years. And even though they were trying to compromise with Britain over taxes and land, it didn't work. So in September of 1774 to October of 1774, the First Continental Congress tried to do those negotiations. Now, one thing to remember about the First Continental Congress is that it was the first government of the 13 colonies. Now, think back to the Mayflower Compact and your House of Burgesses. Those were also somewhat governments, but they were really just documents showing people how they were going to follow the law. This was actually a government. And within this first government, they are going to, there again, try to negotiate with Britain or to compromise with Britain. One of those negotiations, or the most significant negotiation, is about taxes. Okay, by 1774, you've had the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act. The Declaratory Act has repealed other taxes. So Britain's actually going to refuse this compromise or this negotiation. And then, unfortunately, the First Continental Congress is disbanded after this refusal. And there again, the First Continental Congress was to address grievances against the British. So to talk to the British, negotiate with the British, try to compromise with the British. And there again, the biggest complaint they had was about the taxes. So there again, because of the British refusal, it was disbanded. So this could also be said to be a failure of some sort. Okay. Now, our last group of looking at our essential question of how they debated, compromised, or negotiated is the Second Continental Congress. And this one to me is probably the most important because the Second Continental Congress is actually what eventually created the Declaration. And then the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May of 1775. Now, by the time the Second Continental Congress had convened, the war had already started. So we're going to talk more about the Battle of Concord and Lexington, but shots were already fired. So the war had already started. And because the war had already started, they believed that we now needed a Continental Army. So the war already started, so they formed the Continental Army. When I say they, I mean the Continental Congress. I was in the right Congress. So the Continental Army was formed. Now, think back. Who was in charge of the Continental Army? So there's actually a very famous painting of a gentleman in a boat crossing the Delaware River. He has a hat on, he has his leg up on the boat, and it is a very famous painting. And that gentleman was George Washington. And so after the war had already started, the Second Continental Congress actually put George Washington in charge. So there again, if you remember, a young George Washington was in charge when the French began fighting the colonists at Fort Duquesne during the French and Indian War. So this was about 20 years later. So George Washington has more experience being in the military. He's older, he's wiser. So they put him as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Okay? Now, in January of 1776, so still before the Declaration, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet, not a book, it was a pamphlet, and it was called Common Sense. Now, this pamphlet of Common Sense talked about the fact that the colonists should break away from Britain. And the reason they should break away from Britain is, of course, because Britain is not allowing them to have any representation in Parliament. So he advocated for a representative government. And so if you think back to Voltaire, the one who we talked about last year during the Enlightenment, he said separation of church and state. Think about John Locke, life, liberty, and property. Think about Montesquieu. Remember those three branches of government, or even Rousseau, and he was talking about that social contract. So all of those ideas, along with Thomas Paine, who wrote that Common Sense and talked about a representative government, he's also going to talk about free trade with other countries. And so those enlightened thinkers and Thomas Paine had a significant influence on the Declaration. And so they actually started writing the Declaration of Independence in June of 1776. And then there again, of course, on July 4th, 1776, that's why we celebrate 4th of July, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and it was eventually presented to the British king. Okay, there again, King George III. And it was voted 12-0. So all colonies voted yes on this declaration. Now, if you notice, it says 12-0. So one colony was not actually part of the Second Continental Congress, and that's going to be Georgia. So Georgia was not in this. Okay? So all of these different documents are how the colonists tried to debate with the British, how they tried to compromise with the British, and negotiate with the British. Unfortunately, none of these ways worked, and the Second Continental Congress did eventually have to declare our independence. And then after we declared our independence, more extreme fighting began. See that the fighting stopped, and we are now going to become our own independent country. But don't confuse the Declaration of Independence when we actually became our own independent country. Okay, that was just when we declared freedom from Britain. Okay, if you have any questions, please let me know. Have a wonderful day.